Hi, this is Chris, Logos Apologia, and I'm making a reply to Ken, I believe. Ken, you said right off the bat that this wasn't for me because you've had some bad experiences with Christian evangelism. Ken, just let me apologize for that to you. I don't know who you've talked to, but I'm not going to just ignore you or deny what you say out of hand. But I am going to deny a lot of what you said, but it's not just because I don't like it or I can't deal with it. I'm going to point out some errors that you've made in your scholarship. Right off the bat, you said, not all scholars accept these five facts. I didn't mean to imply that all scholars imply, but what I'm basing this on is the scholarship of Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Mike Licona. And Dr. Habermas has compiled a list of all scholars who write on the subject of the resurrection. And this is a lot of secular scholars, a lot of non-believers, probably the majority. 90% of these guys accept the first four facts, and 75% concede the empty tomb. So that's full disclosure. And I'm going to post a link on one of these little YouTube annotations to Dr. Habermas giving you a little breakdown. It's just a couple of minutes and explains how we can claim that the majority of scholars accept these five facts. And that's scholars that write on the subject. And I believe he compiled a list going back to 1975 and has just thousands and thousands of scholarly articles and books. But you can look at that link and hear him explain that in detail. Now let's get into some of your argument here. I appreciate you taking the time, and it's obvious that you've done some reading and research on the subject. And I wouldn't call myself a scholar yet, but I'm working towards that. I'm in graduate school now, working on my master's degree in religion, but I'm not quite there yet where I would call myself a scholar. But as far as Josephus goes, what the things that you brought up are not surprising, and almost everyone recognizes that some of this is a later Christian interpolation. As a scholar, I'm sure you must be aware that there's an Arabic manuscript of Josephus that's been found, and it's a lot more tentative in the language. He doesn't say that he was the Christ. It says his followers called him the Christ. So, most Josephus scholars will believe that this other manuscript reflects a more accurate accounting of what Josephus actually wrote. So it's really old news that there's the interpolation in there. Yeah, we can see that. But really, I was kind of more astonished that, as a scholar yourself, that you weren't aware that Josephus mentions Jesus twice. In Book 20 of Antiquities of the Jews, 200, the part that's relevant, Josephus writes, "So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought them before the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." So, in this little passage, it's talking about James, Jesus' brother, and it says Jesus, who was called Christ, which is probably a more accurate reflection of the testimonium, that Josephus recorded that his followers called him Christ. And, probably a later Christian scribe altered that. He was the Christ. But old news there. But the second passage is not disputed by anyone. And it also is a really good reflection that James's brother was willing to die. He was stoned. And Josephus was in a very good place to know about this, and certainly had access to the records. And, it's an excellent proof of the martyrdom of James and the fact that Jesus was referred to as Christ in the first century. Now, as far as Matthew, you're making a couple errors here as well. You said the Romans recorded everything, and yet we know nothing about the events of this day. Well, you're assuming that we have everything the Romans wrote. We don't. We have very little. Papyri simply doesn't last very long. Things like the Dead Sea Scrolls were in a cave way out in the desert where it never rains, there's no moisture, and those things still crumbled. But, the arid climate out there very well preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. But, when you're talking about in Jerusalem, it rains there, it's moist there, there's all kinds of garbage, bacteria. Literature doesn't last long from the first century. We don't have most of what was written. So, a lot of guys are making this claim, why wasn't more written about Jesus? Someone that made that big of impact, there would have been all these other things written. Well, we don't know what was written because we don't have very much. This is ancient stuff. You should know that. Also, there is a secular source that Thales, who wrote about the eclipse, and it was a debate, and it's a later debate, but I'm going to post the reference, and the thing that's interesting about this is they were debating whether this was a natural eclipse or whether it was a supernatural event. But implicit in the fact that they were making the debate is that it did happen, that it did get dark that day. And these guys were, they weren't right at the time of the event, but they were close enough to the time where there was a recent memory, and they were probably referring to other records. They weren't doubting that it happened, that it got dark that day. They were doubting why it happened. And the argument that is being made here is that the Passover is near a full moon, and we know that an eclipse can't happen at the same time as that. So, there is a reference. So you're dead wrong about nothing confirms Matthew's account. There actually is a secular source that backs that up. And then you claim that we don't have anything by the disciples. I think that's just an absurd claim, that we don't have accounts of the disciples or anyone that knew them. Your argument against the Gospels, that's all really highly debated. But, no one doubts that we have accounts from the Gospels. I did a video on the Creed found in 1 Corinthians 15, which there's really good evidence that we have the oral tradition that goes right back to when the actual event occurred. I'll put a link to that right here, the 1 Corinthians 15 oral creed. And then you talk about 30 years. Well, that's debated. Some people would place Mark even closer. Some people have really good arguments that Matthew was actually the first gospel and that it was in Hebrew. So none of these things that you're saying are really, that solid of arguments against it. But, the thing that I'm amazed at is, do you doubt that an accurate history of Lyndon B. Johnson could be written? That's absurd. Of course it could. There's people alive now that remember them. Oral tradition was around. You don't account for that at all. Most of these people were illiterate, and they had a very strong oral tradition. The Jews memorized the Torah. They could recite the Torah. They memorized the whole Torah. So, these early Christians had a very strong oral tradition, and I think that most of what you find in the Gospels was memorized for a long time before it got written down. It was dangerous to have Christian documents. They were being fed to lions and tortured and killed. So who's going to carry around a gospel? Think about it. I think it was an oral tradition, and then it got written down as these disciples were dying. They said, hey, I need to leave my legacy, and they wrote it down near the end of their lives. And that was probably for safety reasons, and that makes a lot of sense to me. 30 years, 40 years, whatever, I just think that that's a complete non sequitur. It has no bearing on the testimony. Now, sincerity is different with these disciples because of the context. Now, you say that people sincerely die for things that are false. And that's true, obviously. But these guys based their belief in the resurrection on the appearance of Jesus to them. Not only do they say they saw him, they heard him, they touched him. This is what their belief was based on, firsthand knowledge. It's not like someone who reads the Quran and then, is willing to be a suicide bomber. He doesn't have firsthand knowledge that the Quran is true. But James, The brother of Jesus, who we just read in Josephus, was stoned to death for his belief, had firsthand knowledge. Okay? Big difference. So his sincere belief goes a lot further than, someone who doesn't have firsthand knowledge. Okay, so then you get on to Paul. According to Paul, he persecuted the church, and that's not just in Acts. And, you're just not reading Galatians very carefully. I'm sorry, but you made a bad mistake. Let's look at verse 22. Now I'm reading from the ESV, and I did some exegesis and looked this up in the Greek, and you're just wrong. It says, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. Okay, the qualification, and I was unknown in person. Now, if you look up the Greek in that, it means they didn't recognize his face. Okay, they had heard of him. That's what he says right there. He who used to persecute us now, they only were hearing it said. Okay, they had heard about him. So you're just dead wrong on that thing about Paul. You need to look at the verse a little more carefully. James, this literary theme argument, this is kind of a red herring. I'm not going to really spend a lot of time going down that road. I'm sure that some scholar has written a nice little essay on this, or a book. The Gospels do have layers of context, and they were arranged for purposes by the writers, usually probably to address an issue at the church that they wrote it for. But no serious scholar denies that there were oral traditions, Jesus' parables, his sayings, that these were authentic, and that all the Gospels do contain authentic historical material from Jesus. So, the fact that his brother didn't believe him at first is really plausible. And we see in Josephus that he did come to believe. And it's recorded in the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed material as well that Jesus appeared to James. So, this literary thing really doesn't do much for discrediting James's witness. Now, your empty tomb theory. Even if I grant your tomb theory, the disciples' belief in the resurrection was based on appearances, not really the empty tomb. So at most you would debunk the empty tomb. But, your contention about the body, that's interesting. But, okay, think about it. Jerusalem has an arid climate outside the city where the tombs are. It's pretty dry. A corpse's hair, the stature of the person, the distinctive wounds would have all been identifiable after 50 days. It's not going to be bones after 50 days. He would have been identifiable. And even if he was a mess, it still would have been an advantage for them to pull the body out. I think that the wounds would have been identifiable, especially to the extent he was beaten. And it would have caused a mass exodus in the early Christian church. It was definitely to the Jews' advantage to find the body if there was one. But even more damning to that theory is enemy attestation. In the 2nd century, we find two Christian apologists, Justin Martyr and Tertullian, addressing Jewish arguments against the stolen body. Now, these guys weren't just writing for their health. They were writing against a claim. And, when a kid says a dog ate his homework, that's a tacit admission that there's no homework going to be available for a teacher today. So the Jews were making a claim that the body was stolen. So that's really good evidence that the tomb was empty. And so that's really about it. I listened to you, okay? I didn't ignore you, and I didn't just deny you out of hand. But there's a lot of problems with what you've said, and I hope that you'll consider these things. And, Jesus died for you too. And I believe that in my heart. And I believe that, you're worth listening to. And, just because you don't agree with me, I'm not going to just ignore you, or, I don't dislike you. I hope that you'll consider these things, because Jesus really did rise from the dead, and he's proved that we can all conquer death through faith in him, through faith in God. And I hope you'll turn your devotion to God. Take care.